Good afternoon, everyone. It is 1 o'clock Thursday afternoon. It is time to call our regular scheduled Budget and Finance Committee meeting to order for the city of Franklin. First item on the agenda is approval of minutes. Ann, do you have a question on the minutes?
I thought I sent it out.
You want to defer them till next month?
Would you like to defer the minutes and resend them?
We can do that.
Okay, give motion to defer then. You want? Second? All in favor indicate by saying aye. Let's defer the minutes till the next regular scheduled regular scheduled meeting, and we should have 2 copies of the minutes. These minutes, and the ones from last month. Let's go to item 2, presentation of the budget, proposed FY 2019-2020 annual operating and capital budget. Mr. Stuck, you're up. This is.
Got to hit my button. Good afternoon. I'll take the next several minutes to walk through the proposed budget that I submitted to the board late last week and was released publicly early this week. And we'll walk through the highlights of that budget for you. And once I do that, be glad to take any questions, comments at the end of that presentation. So this is the budget that we have before you, the proposed fiscal year 2020 budget. And what we'll walk through is our overall focus, the process that brought us here, highlights of the general fund, and some long-range planning 5-year outlook that we've incorporated in this budgeting effort this year, and then highlights of the other funds that are incorporated in the budget as well. So that's really where we'll go today. Not too unusual, pretty typical in terms of how we've presented the budget to you in the past. These are really the 3 pillars that we've built a lot of our work in the budget and within our overall financing strategies on these 3 components as we talk about strong management of city operations, including a focus on high-quality services, on our budget process itself that we hope incorporates a long-term perspective, needs of the community, and how our departments propose to meet the long-term needs of the community as well. Benchmarking ourselves, looking at how our progress is in terms of service delivery and how we compare not only to ourselves but to other communities across the state of Tennessee and against national standards as well. Community development, that we're looking at ways to enhance our community, make it a strong, vibrant place to live. Our local economy is highly competitive, and we want to make sure that we're supporting that, high development standards, ready to compete as a community, both within the region and nationally. And then really a strong financial base, which runs through everything we do. We talk about long-term financial planning, the capital investment planning that we do on a 10-year horizon, and of course the AAA bond rating that we've been fortunate to earn, but also has been reaffirmed just in the last month or so with both Moody's and Standard & Poor's. So those 3 components really, we try to look at those in what we do and make sure that we are supporting those and that those are strengthened in what we do in the budget. So the process you're very familiar with because you've lived it the last several months. It starts in the fall and runs through April, and the last 3 months we've had departments present to you where they are and where they're going and what some of their needs are and requests are from a budget standpoint. Our budget is founded first on developing a base budget that reflects maintaining current service levels and meeting those expectations in the new budget year, and then allows departments to give you their recommendations, their requests for enhancements to our services and how those might be supported and how those might function. And this year we had over 130 requests totaling over $13 million. So all of this integrates with your long-term strategic plan, and both in terms of what you see in the budget, what we also measure ourselves against in terms of performance measures throughout, and those 4 key components. Every budget request and every enhancement that comes forward is tied to one, if not more, of these 4 strategic themes. And those are safe, clean, livable city, quality life experiences, effective fiscally sound city government providing high-quality services, and then finally, sustainable growth and economic prosperity. We provided you, early in the process, recommended budget goals, which you approved. There are broad themes that I would talk about within those, which are focusing on maintaining high-quality services, investing in our future, enhancing our competitive position, and really maintaining the unique character of Franklin are all things we try to make sure we're living into as we bring proposals forward to you. The budget itself, hit some of the high-level numbers for you. The general fund budget, first of all, it is a balanced budget. It is just a little bit below $73.8 million, which is actually just slightly below the current budget that we have, which is $74.3 million. The all funds budget is a slight increase, just less than 1% as well, and it is at $160.8 million. So those are the high-level numbers, and we'll break those down as we get into future slides here. Highlights of the budget overall, of course, it is a balanced budget. It is in compliance with the board's both debt and fund reserve policies. We are maintaining our current property tax rate, which is one of the lowest property tax rates of any city across the state of Tennessee and nationally at approximately 41 cents per $100 of assessed valuation. Within that, we continue to remain in place the 10 cents or dime of property tax that is dedicated to supporting Invest Franklin initiatives, which focuses on infrastructure and transportation investment, as well as our operational needs. The primary highlight in this budget is the addition of 10 staff positions in the general fund in a variety of areas, really all tied to growth impacts, both service-related to the community, but also in our ability to manage an expanding number of capital investment projects that are also driven by growth needs and our desire to maintain and build on the quality of life of Franklin. So those cut across a wide variety of departments. You see them listed here, but engineering, streets, purchasing, administration, information technologies, parks, and police all have additional staff added to them. The budget does also support pay increases for existing city team members. It's a similar structure to what we've used the last previous two budgets, which is a base increase, market increase of 2.5%, with up to an additional 2.5% based on merit or performance-based increases. So in total, the range for our city team members would be between 3% and 5% based on their performance. So we're glad to be able to provide that level of increase to our city team members and stay competitive in the market. Within the health insurance, very stable, just a 2.5% increase in the traditional healthcare premium structure. That's the first increase in 2 years in that plan. And then the plan that we introduced last year, which is a high deductible plan paired with a health savings account, will be flat this year compared to last. So we'll maintain the current premium structure there. There's key investments in our equipment replacements and needs across the organization, technology enhancements, et cetera. And then, of course, the budget has throughout it performance measures, including the recently received citizen survey results, which help measure the perception of our citizens as well. You will get that. We will present that to you at the second meeting in May. So we've just received that. We'll give you some summary information, but that is also helpful as we look there. So I'm just going to hit a couple highlights in each of the four key strategic theme areas. In safe, clean, livable city, there are 3 police officers added to our staffing, bringing our total sworn officer number to 132 police officers. There is continued ongoing construction of Fire Station 7, supported by our county or city facilities tax, and the purchase of a replacement fire tower, tower number 3, also included in this budget. We are going to also add, through the facilities tax, an additional outdoor warning siren to support our emergency response capabilities. In the effective fiscally sound city government providing high-quality service category, we've got a number of key equipment replacements going on across the organization, especially in sanitation, streets, water management. There is a maintenance of the additional general fund support. An additional $1 million that you saw last year remains in there for additional street maintenance, especially for our neighborhood street resurfacing and our sidewalk repair component. So we want to make sure we're taking care of neighborhood infrastructure. As I mentioned before, there are targeted staff positions, additions that help us with managing our projects more effectively. There's a contract administrator, a senior capital projects inspector, and a road inspector in here that we think will be a vital part of that team. And then the residential recycling improvements that you've just approved in terms of moving from blue bag to blue bins and enhancing that service is also supported in this budget. Within quality of life area, we've got the project for the replacement of tennis courts at Jim Warren. We've got a new position as an assistant parks director that'll especially help us with implementing a number of parks projects that have been approved by the board. In our sustainable growth and economic prosperity, we've maintained a support for pilot programs that help encourage the development of attainable and workforce housing in the community. We maintain our support for enhancements in local transit, as well as the commuter service between Nashville and Franklin and Williamson County as well. So looking at the numbers, when you look at our revenue, we'll start there. Again, we're generating just under $74 million of revenue projected in this budget. About half of that comes from local sales tax. That continues to be our primary source of revenue. When you look at other sources, state shared tax, which is largely based in the sales tax that's collected by the state and sent back to communities based on population, that's our next revenue source. And then the property tax that remains once we've paid our debt service, our general obligation debt service, is our third largest revenue source at just over 10%. So then the balance is a number of different fees and taxes across various categories to make up the balance of that revenue, the remaining approximately 20% or so. When you look at these components by source, again, we're generating over 3/4 of our revenue from consumption-based revenue sources. So that is another reason we maintain very strong reserves, because those are very much susceptible to changes in the economy. So that structure remains in place and something that we're always cognizant of when we look at our budget. So looking at the broader categories of where we spend the money, first by function within the different city departments, public safety is about 48%, so police and fire in that area. And then you look at a number of other areas, the public works component around 17%, community economic development initiatives 14%, and finance and administration at 10%. So within the categories of expenditures, you see that personnel expenses drives our budget. Nearly 3/4 of our budget comes from salary and benefits of our city team members that deliver those services to the community. And then the remaining 21% in operational support components. So when you look at our performance, this is a slide we shared with you before as well. This shows from 2011 on, you see a consistent ability there from 2011 on to consistently add funds to our fund balance to give us that reserve that we talked about in terms of helping us guard against economic downturn. It is also, by your board direction, above a certain level is also a potential funding source for capital projects. And we're in the midst of that process right now. But this just gives you an outlook over the last really 10 years of our performance. And you see that we have consistently spent less than we bring in. And I compliment our departmental teams for their work and being good stewards of public dollars. This is just a summary level. We're going to talk in more detail about the primary revenue sources, but this takes each of the categories of revenue sources and shows you their performance over the last couple years, the current year budget and estimate, and then the proposed budget for 2020, and how that compares. And we'll break down the primary revenue sources in the next few slides. As we talked about 50% of our revenue comes from sales tax. This chart gives you the history of our sales tax growth. The blue line is Franklin's performance. The red line is the state's performance. And you can see that we have, in the last 3 or 4 years, our performance and the state's performance have been almost exactly in sync. I will tell you, 10 years ago, we used to outperform the state pretty significantly, and now we are more in line with one another. I can't explain exactly why that is. We've continued to see pretty strong and steady sales tax growth over the last several years, but they have become more in sync than before. And this coming year, we're projecting total sales tax revenue of $37.1 million. That is a 3.5% growth compared to what is estimated in the current year's budget. And this has been a strong year. We have, right now, we are just about 5.7% above last year's performance for the same period of time. So that's encouraging, but we still wanted to stay on the conservative side, and at 3.5%. Last year we projected 4%. So we're bumping our projection down a little bit year to year, and we're in line with what the statewide estimates are, which range from 3% to a little over 4%. This shows something we've talked to you a little bit about too, which is our comparative of the blue bar being sales tax and the red bar being property tax. It's roughly a 2-to-1 ratio. When we adjusted the property tax 3 years ago, that ratio changed a little bit and has maintained from there. We are seeing steady growth in both of those sources, so it's not quite 2-to-1, which is what it used to be, that or a little more than 2-to-1 if you just turn the clock back 5-6 years. So that just gives you that reflection there. Yeah.
You've got property tax on this chart at 21 and property tax on this one. I guess it's 9. That's after the state, that's after debt service. Debt service is out of this one.
Exactly, yeah. So, yeah, let me walk through that real quick, because sometimes that's confusing when you look at property tax. Its total generation is the number reflected here, which is over $21 million. But we pay our general obligation debt first from property tax, and then whatever's left over goes into supporting operations. So some places you're seeing that net number, which is that first chart showed that. This shows the gross number in terms of total property tax, and so that is reflective there. And so that is a practice we've probably done for the last 8 years or so, and it's something that the bond market and the bond rating agencies really respond positively to, because we're using our most stable revenue source and paying off our debt obligations first. And that is very well received and thought of, and that's one of many components that helps us maintain that high bond rating that we talked about earlier. So the next summary slide really touches on some of that. Intergovernmental revenue, we talked about that. That's showing strong growth. Again, that's a combination of state sales tax that comes back to cities across the state based on your population. It also incorporates business tax receipts, which we've seen some growth in recent years. So that really drives some of our growth here. It also does incorporate the continued phase out of the Hall income tax. So that's all in that mix, but we are seeing some decent growth in this intergovernmental component, or state shared tax is also the term we sometimes use. Property tax, we just talked about that, and while we're projecting a growth around 3%, we did add some additional debt with the bond sale that we will close in the next week or two. And incorporating that new debt service in, we see a net growth in property tax of just under 1%. So considering that we added a pretty significant bond sale to this, it is encouraging that we're still seeing at least a little bit of growth of what's going into the general fund. Other categories such as building permits and the various other fees are pretty much standard increases, kind of an inflationary rate. We are seeing stronger growth in interest income because we're starting to get some better returns on our investments there. So you'll see that in the general fund. You'll see that in some of the capital funds or capital eligible funding sources that have some cash balance in them, like road impact and hotel motel and et cetera.
On the building permits and licenses, it's a slight increase only because we reduced the estimate.
Yeah, I should have mentioned that. Yes, when you look, the budget we presented to you last year and the budget we're presenting today, we've reduced that building permit projection by over $500,000, and we're still seeing strong building activity. We all can see that, but it's not at the pace it was at a year or 2 years ago. So we have adjusted those projections downward to reflect that. The current budget is also in the process of being adjusted down to reflect that. But when you look, when we proposed the budget a year ago to the budget that's proposed today, it is about $550,000 lower in the building permit area.
I do think it's interesting that you pointed out the very first chart where we had almost 1% of the budget was interest income. And that is something that we haven't seen in a long, long time.
We haven't seen it in a really long time.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. At least 10 years. So that's helpful to see that in place, and you see that in some of the other funds as well. I think of hotel motel in particular. It's projecting about a 7% growth, and 5% of that is the growth we're seeing in the activity in that area. But the rest of that is really all interest income because we've got a decent fund balance there. So this chart just summarizes your fund balance and where we are. We're projecting that we'll end the year with a fund balance of just about right at $51 million. That puts us, in terms of a percentage of our budget, at around the 69 to 70% range, depending on whether you look at revenues or expenditures. So that's obviously well above our policy, which is a minimum of 33%. And then the dollars above 45%, we have identified as eligible to help pay for projects. So as we talk about capital projects, that will be one of the sources we will discuss. This slide also just breaks down by the broader categories of expenditure. This gives you some specific numbers in terms of public safety and public works, and you saw a pie chart that reflected that. And then the bottom part of the chart is the categories of personnel, operations, and capital. So this just gives you those same specific numbers as well as the trend over the last 2 to 3 years. So our largest revenue or expense category within the general fund is the personnel area. So this slide really summarizes those major elements of personnel expense. And obviously the annual pay increase is the largest single place to highlight there. That's about $1.6 million. About 60% of that will go to support the across-the-board market adjustment of 2.5%. Then the remaining balance of that goes to the merit-based pay increase, which will be anywhere between 0.5% and 2.5% based on the most recent performance evaluations. So that's put folks between 3% and 5% on average. A little bit over 4% is how we've budgeted. About 4.25% is how this budget was built. And those pay increases will go into effect the first full pay period in July. The city also has updated its pay plan in the last year, so that's carrying through obviously here. And I just wanted to note that we accomplished all of that in last year's budget and had originally planned to spread that over a couple budgets. So that's really all been accomplished, and that, of course, as you remember from last year, included about a 10% adjustment to all of our pay grades to make sure we're staying highly competitive. This is a highlight of the other changes in personnel expense. Again, 10 new positions, and I talked about those various departments previously. The health insurance has stayed relatively stable, only at 2.5% in the traditional health insurance plan, while visual and dental are flat. And then the high deductible plan paired with the health savings account has also remained flat as well. Within pension, you see that final bullet, and then this next chart shows it to you. That's an important part of our personnel expense. It's about just under 11% of our total payroll. And you see that the history of almost 20 years of pension contributions, and it grows about $300,000 this year across all funds. And that equates to about a 7.3% increase year to year in terms of supporting our pension. So one of the things that has happened this year leading into this budget is we've brought a new actuary on board, so we've got a fresh set of eyes, and these numbers, as well as an additional contribution that will be part of the budget amendments proposed for FY19, will get us to where we are hitting the contribution that has been recommended by our actuary. And again, that fund remains very, very strong. This is the outside contributions that we make to different community organizations and partners to provide services. It's down slightly from last year, about $35,000. That really reflects on the opportunity that we had, the commuter bus service that we support that goes from Williamson County into Davidson County and Nashville. We were collectively able to obtain some grant money that lessened the amount of direct city contribution that needed to go into that, supporting that commuter service. So that's helped us reduce here. We do have just a couple places where we've bumped the contributions, one by contract for animal control services with Williamson County. That reflects what's in our contract. And then we did have a $5,000 increase for the Gentry Education Foundation. In terms of long-range planning, this is an area I want to highlight because we spent a good bit of extra time on this topic. When each department came before you, they each reflected on what they saw as their needs over the next 3 to 5 years. And so we really brought all that together with both updated revenue projections and with what we saw from those departments, and wanted to reflect that so that you could see not just the budget decisions you're making for the next 12 months, but also how that plays out over the next 5 years. And so part of that is to look at our revenues. Again, we try to be fairly conservative there, and the growth that is in here really reflects around a 3% growth pattern in our general revenues. The exceptions that you see a couple places where revenue bumps up. You see it here on this chart. In 2022, we see the sales tax component. Right now, you've dedicated the city's half of the additional sales tax is going to schools for the first 3 years. That ends in the third year of this 5-year outlook, which is fiscal year 2022. So that we have a portion of that coming back in. So of that part that's coming back in, we allocated only half of it to operations. The other half is incorporated in the financial plan for supporting capital projects. So essentially we took those dollars and put half of them into operations from a planning standpoint and the other half into capital project support. So what you also see, the other piece, yes, yeah.
Is that going to be paying off the TIF?
That is, yes, year 5, exactly. You got it. Year 5, and you see that here, the tax increment financing district in the area around McEwen, lots of times referred to as the Nissan TIF. We project that will be retired around the 5th year of this outlook, and that will bring those property tax dollars in as a general fund revenue source. Prior to that, they've been used entirely to pay off a debt associated with that TIF district. So once that debt is retired, it becomes a general fund revenue source. So that's reflected in these projections as well. This pie chart gives you, again, the same outlook that we did about FY20 budget. This gives it to you as a projection in fiscal year 24. And you'll see with that additional sales tax, we become a little more dependent on sales tax than we are today at around 55% compared to today's budget or the proposed budget for 2020, which is at 50. Now, on the next category kind of takes you through the expenditure side. Again, we tried to bring together some of the projections that departments gave us and made some general assumptions there. This includes additional approximately 27 positions over the life of the 5-year planning horizon. I will note that those are more backloaded, more year 3 through 5, and then gives you a sense of what's there, and then just other projections that we have about other expenditures that we think we're going to need to do from various supplies and materials, equipment replacements, what we would assume we'd incur from that standpoint. So this again shows you some of those expenditure needs tracking pretty closely to the revenue that we have, and that's what this final chart shows you is those revenues and expenses together. And each year we do show some available funds year to year. My general assessment is year 1, which is the current budget that we're recommending today, and year 2 are pretty much flat. They're going to be tracking pretty much right on each other. And then we see revenue growth with the sales tax coming in year 3, and then the property tax from the retirement of the TIF coming in year 5. And you see the projected fund balances, assuming that straight line. And of course, that's going to be impacted somewhat by what happens with capital projects, but again, still shows us well within compliance of your reserve policies. This slide really is just a reference for you to go directly in the budget document to the various individual funds. I'll touch on a few highlights of the other non-general fund categories. This slide, following slide, really summarizes both all funds and general fund in terms of expense categories. Obviously, general fund being our primary avenue through which we deliver services to the community is heavily personnel oriented. The all funds is less so because you've got more of our special funds that relate to specific functions and funding specific elements of what we do, often capital projects and other elements. So it's a little less personnel heavy than you see in the general fund. So I'm going to just run through a few highlights of some of the other funds just to give you those. Stormwater Fund, we've programmed the remaining balance that our initial analysis of the Stormwater Fund showed was available to fund projects around $2.5 million. From there, we'll work with the board on some policy direction later in the year about where that fund how that should be structured, any revisiting of fees, et cetera, and I expect that would lead into the next year budget. So.
On there, it still says various projects. It really does not name them. And that is, to me, that is extremely important, especially
Right.
considering that our last meeting, we also voted on what we were going to do with flood house raising.
Yes, so
I mean, as I say, it just says various projects. It really does not say, maybe there's one of them that mentions the Battle Avenue, but I mean, as far as the money.
well, and the
Yes.
reason that is because the board is still making decisions on capital projects. So Battle Avenue, the repairs at Maplewood, and the home raising are all ones that have been identified fairly high on your priorities. They exceed what's going to be available in this fund, but we're anticipating you using around $2.5 million to fund some composition, some grouping of those projects that you've identified. So I would expect through your capital investment project, we will prioritization, we will be able to identify those shortly. So you'll see specific projects identified once you've completed that process.
And I also noticed that I just read in the newspaper what was going to be on our agenda for next Tuesday, and there's an additional project from Stormwater on the work session.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. On sanitation, we are also moving forward, as I talked about, with transitioning to the curbside recycling containers from the blue bags. We are also replacing over $1.2 million of aging equipment. And the highlight, really, that first bullet that there is no fee increase and there is no tax subsidy budgeted for this fund. And in fact, in fiscal year 19, we see no subsidy and actually see that fund contributing a little bit to its own fund balance for the first time ever, at least any time I know of, in terms of having that happen there. And again, we'll meet the comptroller's requirements in terms of the fund balance that we have to maintain, but it's encouraging to see that the fund's going to be able to do that for itself in the current budget year. In hotel motel, there is, again, solid revenue growth. I referred to this when we talked about interest earnings. About 5% of that number is what we're going to see and what we're projecting in collections of hotel motel tax. The balance, 2.4%, we think is going to come from interest earnings in that. And again, there's capacity in this fund as we build the capital project plan to help support especially parks-related projects. Also in other funds, that same theme is carried through. City facilities tax, county facilities tax, the Parkland Dedication Fund, the Road Impact Fee Fund, all have some capacity in them. And as you make decisions around specific priorities in your capital investments, you'll see us begin to budget some of that capacity towards priority projects. So we have budgeted what we know of in those funds today, but I would expect you'll see in the first part of this year as we identify specific projects, you'll start to see us allocate some of those funds towards selected projects. Of course, facilities tax is supporting Fire Station 7. That's just starting construction now, and then some limited new equipment in fire and sanitation as they expand services driven by growth. On water and wastewater, you really have already made the decisions related to adjustments in the fee structure. There will be an increase of 2.9% in the water rate come January 1 and 3.5% in the wastewater or sewer fee come January 1 of 20. Other than that, it's really consistent with what you've already identified in terms of project support and debt requirements within those funds. There is about $400,000, $425,000 of equipment replacement, and we're continuing to support the rate-funded capital components consistent with what we've done in the last several years, and all supported by within the rate plan and the cost of service study that was completed earlier, really late last year, earlier this year. Then in conclusion, this budget meets your goals. It continues to support local investments and needed infrastructure and services through Invest Franklin, which continues to be a dedicated portion of property tax. It meets your goals. It meets the objectives overall, puts our general fund reserves in a strong position to support the community and provide stable services and support projects that are of value to the community as we move forward. I want to take a minute to just thank our team. This is absolutely a team effort across every department, and the folks sitting at this table in particular, Michael and Mike and Christine, and the ACA's, Assistant City Administrators, and folks in Human Resources, Kevin Townsell and his team are vital parts of us working through the budget itself, the base budget, and the program enhancements that folks bring forward for your consideration. And I'm really grateful for their stewardship, their leadership, and running their departments every day, and really the fine work that our finance team does in supporting this effort. So I'm glad to take any questions you have and follow up on any items that we've talked about today. We would only ask that you forward this to the full board for their vote for first reading at the May 28th meeting, followed by public hearing in the first meeting in June, and final approval second meeting in June.
And I would just add, your next three items do just that.
Yes.
So items 3, 4, and 5 are the formal votes.
So you need a vote on 3, 4, and 5.
That's correct.
Okay. Any questions on the presentation? Then let's go to item 3, consideration of ordinance 2019-17, an ordinance to adopt a budget for fiscal year 2019-2020 Christine, do you all have any comments on that?
The ordinance is in accordance with the budget as presented by the city administrator.
I can go back through this if you want.
No, no.
We got out under 40 minutes. I don't know.
It's a new record, yeah.
So, motion to forward to the full board?
So move seconded.
Proper motion and a second. All in favor indicate by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion passed. We'll pass this on to the full board. Item 4, consideration of ordinance 2019-18, an ordinance to establish a property tax rate for fiscal 2019-2020. Property tax rate remains the same. I'll entertain a motion. All in favor indicate by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? Item 5, consideration of resolution 2019-45, a resolution adopting the estimate of revenues and expenditures for the Water and Sanitary Sewer Utility Fund for fiscal year 2019-2020 and providing an effective date.
Again, your rates are already established. This is really just the expenditure side of the budget.
I guess I recommend that we send it for approval.
Okay? Proper motion and a second that we forward this to the full board. All in favor indicate by saying aye. Aye. Item number 6, consideration of ordinance 2019-16, fourth quarter 2019 budget amendments. Michael?
Good
you
afternoon.
You usually handle the budget amendments.
Usually I do, and usually I will. Good afternoon. This is your final budget amendment. It's a little cumbersome, so bear with me. We've tried to make it as simple as possible. We come to you throughout the year to amend the budget to ensure that at this time, and certainly on June 30th, each fund has sufficient fund balance and cash balance to pay its bills at the end of the year to comply with state comptroller restrictions and statutes. This is obviously no different. There's a lot of moving pieces, but they really break down into 3 categories. Year-end cleanups, or true-ups, if you will, at each of the departmental levels within the general fund and then the fund levels within the rest of the funds. Year-end contingencies, those funds that may need additional fund or cash balances transferred into them, but at the end of the day they may not, which is why the ordinance is written very specifically if necessary. And then third, pensions. The First Amendment is by far the largest, and it applies to 7 funds. And that is really sort of the year-end cleanups. As Eric has mentioned, most of these, they will sound familiar to you. In general fund revenues, we are increasing local sales tax, and we are increasing investment income, and we are decreasing building permits by equivalent amounts. Obviously, when you build a balanced budget, you have to keep it in balance. So we are recognizing where revenues are exceeding our original expectations and estimates, and we are lowering them where they are not meeting them. Those you've already seen and have been explained how those impact next year's budget in the previous presentation. The final adjustment to revenues to increase fund balance by a net amount of $1,030,000. That is to pre-fund next year's pension obligations. That's Amendment 3, and Eric already mentioned that to some degree. On the expenditure side, there are, yes, ma'am.
You know, on the local sales tax, it might be, talk about that a little bit more, because that's a little unusual to decide to up that whenever we still have 3 months of it left.
So, right, and normally we wouldn't necessarily do this.
Exactly.
There's a couple of factors why we are. Number one, we are 5.7% above our year-over-year estimates from last year at this time. This estimate of $300,000 of increase takes into account our previous estimates for the remaining months of the year, which were only a 4% increase on budget to budget from the prior year. Because we've already recognized that growth, the unanticipated in the first 8 months, we feel confident enough that we can meet our original targets in the final 4 months. The other factor that this, of course, allows us to do is it allows us to be conservative apples to apples so that our budget and our estimate for year end are really, really similar, and our estimate for next year's budget is only 3.5% higher. And we've gone through the rationale as to why that is. Any other questions on local sales tax? Okay. Shifting to expenditures, there are 5 separate categories within the general fund. One of the largest is accounting for vacancy adjustments. Each year, you may remember, we use a factor of 3.5% as a decrement in each wage budget because we have learned over time that most departments have vacancies. People come, people go, and that amount on average has been about 3.5%. Now, not all departments have vacancies every year, which is good. We want to keep and maintain and develop and nurture our employees. For those that don't, we are recommending transfers in to cover that deficit that never obviously materialized. There is an increase in overtime within the police department. Police department's overtime budget has been slightly higher each of the last several years. We are taking steps in the fiscal 2020 budget to alleviate that moving forward. There are several overages and expenses that were unanticipated. One of the largest, you'll see this in both the general fund budget in parks and in hotel motel, is we originally budgeted around $500,000 for the Jim Warren tennis court renovations. That came in and you approved a contract for $850,000 with contingencies. The other thing you will notice is that this is now split over FY19 and FY20 because we anticipate the project being completed after July 1st in the beginning of the new fiscal year. We've also had some increased costs in information technology with some emergencies that they've had to deal with throughout the year in maintaining various infrastructure. There are expense underages, for lack of a better term. I really couldn't come up with one, of about $3 million. That comes in from general expenses, which is just under $750,000, and that's for additional wage monies that we won't necessarily be needing, or medical contingency funds that we won't be needing, as well as a large chunk of expense authorization for projects in TAC, which will not be completed this year. So you don't need that budgeted authorization because at the end of the day, it simply won't come to fruition. And then finally, transfers to various funds. There are 3 transfers involved here, and I'll cover those when we actually get to those funds. In state street aid, there are 2 changes in revenues. We are increasing transfers from the general fund by $250,000 and decreasing the property tax by $250,000. This is because this is the proper way to account for the application of the sidewalk gap monies from Invest Franklin. The money's actually been collected via your property tax ordinance and deposited in the general fund and recognized there. It makes more sense, we've adjusted the 2020 budget to reflect this, that we formally transfer the money into the street aid fund from the general fund. Money will all end up in the right place. This just allows Mike at year end to do it in a way that the auditors are happy about. We are also reducing the paving budget by $150,000. We had hoped to increase this budget last year, or actually for this current fiscal year, so that Joe, who I assume is still sitting behind me, could go out and do more paving. The reality is we didn't quite get as much as we had hoped in the gas tax. And so we need to maintain a minimum fund balance in this account every year for state comptroller happiness and sound fiscal prudence. And so we are going to lower that by $150 to make sure we meet that target at June 30th. In the road impact fund and parkland dedication funds, there's a combined transfer increase of $480,000 from the general fund to cover your vote on Resolution 2019-36 was to cover those respective fees for the Franklin Housing Authority at the Chickasaw Senior Housing Development. That was voted on, I believe, 2 meetings ago? Last meeting? Okay. As you know, some of them all blur together. The aforementioned increase in the hotel motel tax fund for the Jim Warren tennis courts In the Community Development Block Grant Fund, we're increasing both revenues and expenditures by $68,000. Our federal award this year, we always budget around 250. Our federal award letter was actually 318. So this enables a few more projects in support of projects to be done. In the drug fund, we've purchased several vehicles and have additional radio expenses. A lot of the radio expenses stem from the shift to the new communication system, and there are drug fund eligible components which can be paid out of that, which will enable our officers, and especially in CID, to communicate and do what they need to do. And that concludes Amendment 1. Amendment 2 is year-end contingencies. Just like last year, we are recommending a $1 million transfer, if necessary, to the transit fund. Just like last year, we have timing issues related to the receipt of federal grant monies. They're going to get the grants. They will come in. We just don't know exactly when. So in order to cover properly for year end, we're recommending that we increase both revenues and expenditures in that fund. Those transfers will only be made if necessary on June 30th to cover any deficits that we see. And finally, there's pensions. As you are aware, the actuary came back with a higher recommended pension contribution for fiscal 2020. We had budgeted $4.83 million across all funds in fiscal 2020. We got this information halfway through meeting with each of you one-on-one a week before the budget was due. Rather than trying to throw the baby out with the bathwater and recalibrate the entire budget, we knew we were running well in fiscal 19, and the recommendation to you through this amendment, through the city administrator, is to take $1.15 million and contribute it to the pension fund now in fiscal 19. When we know we have money received, we've already trended in such ways that the surplus has been generated. And then maintain the $4.83 million contribution level in 2020. I will tell you there are three components to the increase. The first was demographic changes. The second was the lowering of the contribution or expected contribution rate from 7.4% on investments to 7.3%. That 10 basis point reduction is an effort of the pension committee to try to achieve over 5 years to lower it from 7.5 to 7. But the biggest one is simply the measurement period was taken on December 31. And if you remember, the fourth quarter of last year was not kind to anybody's portfolios, and our pension fund was certainly no different. The good news is, hopefully, in a year, when the next actuarial is done, most of that has already been made up in gains in the first quarter of this year. So we should see some modification. Don't promise, don't hold me to that. But doing this now is the right thing to do, honors our commitments, and we should be able to see some type of balancing out in future years.
And if I may step in just for a moment, our next meeting of our pension committee is June the 3rd. That's a Monday afternoon at 1 p.m. And our actuary, Finley, will be here to do a presentation on those actuarial results, and we'll talk in more detail about the aspects that Michael was just describing.
And real quick, remind us, that pension's what, 94-95% funded, which is extremely high, and for most.
I believe it's closer to 90%. That is, of course, we actually do. It's a snapshot in time.
Right.
That, certainly we now do have two pension funds, and this is the closed pension fund that is no longer open to new enrollees. So we do have an active pension fund through the Tennessee Consolidated Retirement System for all of our employees hired since January of 2017. And that plan has a different measurement period. That's on June 30th. And we'll note that while we have over 100 employees who are covered by that plan now, but that funding percentage actually went down just slightly, but it was a different measurement period. And that we're going to, for some time, have two plans that we report on that have two different point of time of measurement. So there will probably be this occurrence in some other year in the future in which, December 31st looked one way, that fourth quarter looked one direction, and then the second quarter of another year looked the same, and we have to report both in our financials.
Any other questions on the pension portion? Michael?
With that, I will answer any further questions. Otherwise, hopefully, you're done with the fiscal 19 budget.
Any questions on the budget amendments? Then I'll entertain a motion to present these to the full board. All in favor indicate by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? We'll carry those to the full board then. Item 7, report on the status of the issuance of the City Franklin Series 2019 A and B General Obligation New Money and Refunding Bonds. Christine, Eric?
Well, actually, in some ways, you've either read or have just heard from the city administrator the outcomes of this item in this report, which we're bringing to you. Back in February, staff came to this committee and presented a proposal to issue simultaneously the planned new money bond issue for 2019, as well as a refinancing bond issue of a 2009 Build America bonds, and which you recommended to the full board, and the full board approved bond resolutions back in March. When we met as a committee in April, we were within a few days of actually going to competitive sale, but we had not locked in those rates yet. And so we promised that we would come back to you with a report, and certainly once on April 17th, when the competitive sale was held and the bonds were awarded, we forwarded those final numbers to the folks who were putting the details of the budget together, so that those numbers could be incorporated into this budget. But we wanted to, and there's a memo within the item here that gives some amount of detail. We are almost complete with the issuance process. We do close next week on May the 15th, and we're rushing up to that date. It's almost here. But we did on April 17th go to a competitive sale. The board had authorized up to the issuance of up to $61.5 million of bonds, of which $34 million of proceeds would go toward funding new money projects, capital projects, which the board had already approved, and the balance would be used to refinance those 09 bonds. I believe I did give you the anecdotal comment back last month that we expected to have some original issue premium when we actually went to sale, situation in which coupons, the interest rates on the bonds, would actually be higher than the yields that were in the current marketplace, and that did occur. That was it's a structuring mathematical type equation function, but we actually we're issuing $52.5 million of bonds with a little over $8 million of original issue premium. So when we have original issue premium, we do the math and we reduce that bond size. So we are going to have proceeds that are sufficient to do what we want to do, but wanted to point out that the actual bond size of $52.5 million will incur additional funds that we will use to both pay off our 09 bondholders as well as fund our $34 million of capital projects. While we did have some complexity with having a refinancing and new money, we certainly were well received by the market. The bonds were, as our city administrator mentioned, received a AAA bond rating, similar to our other bond issues. We did have a little bit of a story with the refinancing. We had a tax opinion that was fairly new, simply because those were Build America bonds that were issued during a time period in which a temporary law was put into place at the federal level that allowed for tax-exempt projects to be issued as taxable bonds with a federal government subsidy. And these are now have been issued as very straight, plain vanilla, fixed-rate bonds, tax-exempt by the city of Franklin. But we went out to market with this larger bond size. We did receive 12 bids, 12 qualified bids. That was something we were very excited to see, significant interest from the bond market. And also the spread between the low bidder and the high bidder was only 6.5 basis points. So sometimes a bank may put in a bid that they're not all that serious, but when you have a 6.5 basis point spread, everyone who put in a bid was serious about this bond issue and wanted to win it. They wanted to be able to win this bid. So once we verified our low bidder was Citigroup, the mayor did award the bonds to the low bidder, Citigroup, and we began working toward a close. We did receive significant savings on our refinancing, and that is incorporated in this budget on a gross basis over 10 years. That's interest savings of $2.3 million. On a net present value basis, which is a calculation that we are required to do for tax exempt bonds, it's closer to $2 million, but it's in essence $200,000 a year of interest savings from affecting this refinancing. And certainly while we have to, for tax purposes, record this as one bond issue, according to IRS rules, we do consider these two different series of bonds. The true interest cost on the new money piece of bond is 2.68%. So we have a final maturity that goes out 20 years. The average life is 10 years. On our refinance bonds, we are under 2% at 1.83%. With the measure for refinancing bonds and how well you did, that calculation, we have percentage savings of right at 8%. And typically 3% in that calculation is where you believe that you've achieved adequate savings. So in all the measures of this transaction, we believe it went very well and was well received. We've done all of our postings that we're required to do so far for a public offering. We have different steps along the way, but we will be moving toward closing on May the 15th. We're also working on investing of the new money bonds, the $34 million, which will be used for projects. Those projects will be completed within the next 3 years. So we have advisement from our project managers of how those monies are planning to be spent. So we're working on those investments. And when our comptroller gives his fourth quarter report later this summer, those proceeds will be recorded to the capital project fund. So you'll see that a significant increase in the balances of the capital project fund for fiscal year 19. That's my report. I'm certainly be happy to entertain any questions you may have.
Any questions from the committee? Then, let's go to item 8. Item 8 is consideration of resolution 2019-43, authorizing and directing the Industrial Development Board of the City of Franklin to prepay a portion of its taxable rate tax increment revenue refunding bonds, Series 2015A variable rate. Christine, I guess you or Eric are up again.
I'm back again, and we're fortunate for the third fiscal year in a row. We've got a process in place that we're glad to be back to make a recommendation to this committee for prepayment of the 2015 TIF loan. This was a bond issue, a loan that was originally issued back in 2005. It was refinanced in 2015. That's why we call it the 2015 loan, even though it originated before then. That 2015 loan has a fixed rate component, which is almost paid off. I believe the final maturity is in 2020, and then we had a variable rate component, which was at the back end. And the last 2 years, we asked this committee to consider a recommendation to use additional proceeds from the balance of this TIF calculation toward prepaying that back end and prepaying variable rate maturities from the very back end, working our way back to the current. Once we'll eventually hopefully be able to get to the point we'll just be paying the whole thing off early, which we know we will. But we're back to we have a recommendation to prepay another $600,000 of this loan. I will give you just a snapshot that the taxes billed in the TIF area did just slightly exceed $2.1 million this year. It was $2 million. It crossed the $2 million threshold last year. However, in doing the calculations to make the recommendation to you, we do have we're very close to a resolution on a property tax appeal in this district. The State Board of Equalization ruled, and we're toward the end of a waiting period on that ruling. And I do have an assumption for that calculation of what we will be, based on that ruling, would be repaying, which would be about $100,000 from that ruling, and that would be recorded this fiscal year, either as we will pay that by June 30th, or we will record as an accrual, because we do have that information. But simply, we are very close from what we are being advised by Williamson County to resolution. So while we certainly, I'm having the calculation that we have net revenues of $1.9 million. On a billing, we're up at $2.1 million. So this was something that, thankfully, or not thankfully, but it does take a few years for these large appeals to go through the process through the state. It's out of the control of the county, because these types of appeals do have a complexity, and they get sent straight to the state to be administered. So, but we are close. I have taken that calculation into account to ask for $600,000 of prepayment, with a recommendation and then approval by the full board. We would go ahead and do that defeasance before June 30th, and we would have actually, at that point, have prepaid $1.9 million on that loan over the last 3 fiscal years, which would leave a June 30 principal balance of around $5.9 million outstanding between the fixed and the variable piece.
Any questions? Considering it is a resolution, we would need a motion to forward that to the full board. Do I hear a motion? Second. All in favor indicate by saying aye. Aye. Let's go to item 9. Consideration of procurement award to Fifth Third Bank of Charlotte, North Carolina, in the total annual estimated amount of $9,439 for custody services for non-pension investments of the city for the Finance Department Purchasing Office Procurement Solicitation Number 2019-015. $10,000 budgeted in 11-85520-41500 for fiscal year 2019, contract number 2019-0149. Michael, did you write that?
Yeah, good afternoon. I do apologize for the long caption. This item is on the agenda because we put out a competitive process, and after we got the proposals, the Finance Department would like to recommend Fifth Third Bank to provide custodial services for non-pension investments. And what that means is essentially they have custody of the assets. It may be electronic, maybe paper, but they also do the transactions where, in essence, when we invest in investments, where we basically, when they mature, to receive interest income. So that's the services they do. And in the proposal, they're submitting a amount of $9,439, which is actually under the budgeted amount. So the Finance Department is proposing that this be our custodial bank, and they currently are our custodial bank. So even though that won't change, we actually will have online access to their system, which we haven't had in the past. So we're actually looking to have that access.
Any questions or comments? My question, do we need a motion to forward this to the full board?
Yes, we
Okay.
will, yes.
I'll entertain a motion. It's only been an hour and 10 minutes in the meeting. And that is a proper motion and a second. All in favor indicate by saying aye. Aye.
Some of these are weirder than others, though.
Let's go to item 10, preview of payroll policy. Eric?
Yeah,
Mike?
that's it. So
Okay.
after a long caption, actually now a very short caption. At your meeting in June, the Finance Department actually would like to provide to you 2 new policies, one being a payroll policy and one being a capital assets policy. And what we did for the committee last May, and we're bringing this as well, is before you actually see a final copy, we wanted to run down those items that we would actually have in the draft. And what we're doing is not only necessarily taking the items here to the committee, behind the scenes, we're actually also getting input from departments, from Eric, from Christine, legal, Kevin on the payroll policy, just to make sure that we've kind of had input from all parties that would have an interest in these. So if you look at the payroll policy, what this is and why it's new is because it's formerly been in the HR manual. So what we're doing and working with Kevin is actually going to separate payroll policy from personnel policy. So what we're trying to do is, first, is to bring a lot of the policy that's already in the HR manual into this policy. So if it were approved, payroll policy would actually be in here instead of referring to the HR manual. So that's actually the first item that we're looking toward. The next item we're wanting to do is, this would actually be a policy that would cover payroll processing, so it wouldn't have any effect on time and attendance, because time and attendance is in the Human Resources Department. The other things that we're hoping to have in the policy, as we're going down the items, we want to make sure that we cover all the pay codes there are. Because maybe the last time, if you looked at the HR manual, it may not have all the pay codes that were used, and we'd like to make sure that the policy has all of those pay codes in it. And as well as that, we want to make sure we cover all the things, tax withholding and deductions and benefits that are also paid through payroll. So we're trying to make sure it's very comprehensive in what it is that we have in payroll processing. The other thing is we would like to also cover some new areas, because employees can actually make changes to their payroll, some items like their ACH account and things, and they can do it online. So we'd like to even mention the policy that that is one of the things that employees have the ability to do. And some things that also have come up is just responsibilities for payroll records, how to look at their W-2, as well as we know we've had questions about how to treat travel time, how to treat inclement weather. So we're thinking in the policy, we'd like to cover all of these areas, as well as actually have the definitions that pertain to payroll. So the reason we're trying to get as much input as possible is just to make sure if there's something that needs to be covered, it's included before you see the draft come June.
Any questions from the committee? Mike, I assume you covered probably 10, 11 both, right?
Yes.
Okay. Do we need to do anything?
Oh, I'm sorry, I apologize. No, this is just for information only, just for.
Yeah, there's no
Okay,
action.
Yes.
no action.
In June
It's
is
coming.
when
It's
there will
coming.
be an action.
Okay.
Yes.
How about item 12, status report of active city grants?
There actually is one item before that, if you'd like me to cover about the capital assets
Yeah, oh.
policy. Or I could cover the grants.
No, go ahead and go to the capital assets.
Okay. Along the same lines, discussion only, is that what we hope to do in the capital assets policy is basically provide some clarification. Because we know that we put capital assets into the annual report, but we know departments are the ones that are acquiring the capital assets. So a lot of what's been done with capital assets is just always been by word of mouth. So what we're hoping to do with the policy is to actually just have that common understanding of what a capital asset is. And in fact, that's really the first thing that we're covering in the policy is what is a capital asset. And it really goes back to it's something we own or have rights to. It also is something that is above a threshold, and we've always used 25,000 as the threshold in the past. So the item has to be above that amount. And it actually has to have a life of 3 years or more. So the thing is, if you're coming new into the city, it may be something that you may not know per se, but it's one we know with the policy. That way we can be able to say, this is what a capital asset is. So what we like to do is just give those definitions, talk about the thresholds, talk about what goes into each capital asset. Because even with the purchase of a vehicle, there are certain things that are added onto the vehicle. So in essence, what to include, what not to include. Making sure that we record them consistently, making sure there's a numbering so that when we do an inventory, we can always make sure that we can locate that capital asset, as well as also depreciation, how to deal with donated capital assets. What happens if you transfer an asset between a governmental fund and a water sewer fund? So what we're trying to do is maybe cover that. And one of the maybe items that we want to make sure we addressed is, if you have capital assets, then what kind of tracking do we have? Is it something within your department that you keep by spreadsheet, or is it something that what you've done is you've actually got it into our capital asset system? So in essence, it's being able to have a list at least on an annual basis. And also finance, as part of our year-end procedures, would always go in and spot check those lists. So that's what we're thinking would be covered in the capital assets policy.
Do we have, does the public have access to a list of the city's capital assets? Is that on our website?
They would. I mean, if it were requested, they would.
Right now, the reporting for capital assets is in accordance with the generally accepted accounting procedures and principles that you see in our audit, which is not that detailed. I mean, certainly to get to those numbers, we have lots of lists. Yes, and I'll just give one bit of context, if that's okay. Until about 20 years ago, we, on the government accounting side, we really did not have a lot of record keeping about capital assets. Certainly you had lists of, we have this numbers of fire stations, or we have this land, but really with any sort of values beside it, until about 20 years ago, you didn't see that in governmental audits, and you certainly didn't talk about it in your role as board members with a fiduciary responsibility. But there was a major accounting change that started being talked about 20 years ago, which was a GASB Statement 34, which required us as accounting people to go in there and put values on governmental assets, make lists of governmental assets, and then put values. And certainly there's actually been quite a few statements regarding capital assets that we have to follow those accounting rules since then. And so that was something that we, as finance staff, talked about, that the complexities of the accounting rules have got to the point that having a policy which is not just cutting and pasting from the accounting rules, that is something we can live by, and that we can certainly have for our departments, who are such a vital part of our record keeping, that they would not just be hearing us talk about, well, GASB statement number this says this, or because that's really something that has been a complexity over the last 20 years, and it's just grown. But these definitions that Mike was talking about, we're referencing these changes in accounting rules and wanting to put this in a way that's more understandable to people who don't have to live with accounting rules every day.
Any other questions? Mike, you want to do the grants?
Yes. Again, discussion purposes only, but what we're trying to do is, there are certain things that we keep track of in the finance department, and what we thought would be worthwhile is at least once a year, bring that information to the committee. So it's kind of like with investments, we've done it, with debt, but we knew we hadn't in a long time brought you a grant report. So what we ask is, we ask staff that deal with grants what information they have. And in fact, one of the first pieces of information is, how many grants did we have? Because like I said, maybe last committee meeting, when I came, it was a handful. So what happened is, we determined that we have 26 active grants currently with the city. And what I thought may be helpful is, since this is the first time we've done this report, maybe just let the committee know what the columns are that we have on this report. So I didn't know if you had it in front of you, but we try to design it to be able to provide information that could be useful not only to the committee, but also to departments and finance staff. So this is the report we developed, and what it does is, if you just read across, what it does is, it starts with the grant name, including like the project. It also tells you the grant ID, tells you department, tells you contact persons in the department. It also tells you start and ending dates, as well as when you get to the column of estimated cost, this is actually the amount on the grant agreements that between all the parties, they say they believe it will cost. So that's what estimated cost is. Then we know there is a local portion. So what we did in the column after that is subtract off that local portion. So what remains is what we're eligible to receive reimbursement. So then what we did is with that amount, we looked and asked the departments, what amount have you received? What amount have you requested? And what amounts are still out there that we haven't requested? So if you look over at those columns, that's what you see near the end. And that's why we have those highlighted, because we're trying to work with departments to be able to make sure that if money has been spent, that we're getting it reimbursed. And then the last column is, and there's usually several factors, but the balance remaining is actually where you had a grant, and this shows amounts have not been spent yet. So what we'd like to do is just essentially provide this format in future grants reports if it's acceptable. And what we'll do is we'll keep it updated and make sure that it's useful not only for today, but for future as well. And and if there's any particular grant you would like me to cover, but I know, like, even if you look at Matt Catcher, you'll see the 5 million local portion that we knew that we had.
I guess my one question would be just on the Columbia Avenue grant, that 21 million. I mean, we see the ending date of October 2020. We know it's not gonna be complete by then, but I guess that means we need to have, what, design finalized, or, yeah, maybe
You know,
comment on that.
And those are the items, again, the reason we ask for those dates is to kind of be able to see that and get with them. So it's almost when that's the date that is on there, and sometimes dates can be extended, but as far as what it is that needs to be accomplished, that's what we're working with the department on.
And the granting agency establishes that end date, and that, as Mike was saying, we want to keep up with that on our accounting side, certainly because if we know that we're getting close and we need to ask for an extension or reconsideration, that we do that before we reach a.
And on that one
Any date.
specifically, that's probably a date that we would have design done. I mean, and I think that's realistic. From there, we have known that actual construction is 3 to 4 years out by the time we get through everything. So I can't speak to why that date is there, but I would expect we'd only be through design by that stage, so. Yeah, that's true. Let's hope.
But we do pull those dates off of the paperwork from the approved grants
Yeah.
to keep up with it.
And it may just be in 5-year windows that operates, I'm not sure, but yeah.
You know, thinking about that, I think I was trying to get some information, speaking of the stormwater, about what was the next step in some of that and where, but I haven't heard anything back from
Yeah.
anybody.
We would need to we would need some guidance from Army Corps on that.
Yes.
Specifically. We now know what our role will be, and then we need to, in a unified way, get information out to property owners about how Army
Oh,
Corps is
yeah, well,
gonna be work with
that's a
them.
good
So
point.
it's really, we're gonna need to work hand in hand. I did see that request, I just don't know. I think we need some guidance from Army Corps about timing and how that will work. But now we have an answer, we can say, of what the local participation will be from the city.
So really, it will be getting back in touch with them and saying,
Yeah, we have a
Okay.
decision, here's what the city's
Oh,
gonna
okay.
do. So as we communicate that, that's what property owners, they'll have a more complete picture, and then they can make a decision. Because again, it's an entirely voluntary program.
right, and I think some of them were asking because they wanted to know what is their time frame
Right,
to
yeah.
have to make a decision, and so that was one
Yeah,
of the
we're gonna
reasons
need
I
to
was
get those
asking.
answers
Yeah,
ourselves, so
yeah,
we'll,
okay.
we'll get that for you.
Thank you.
This is an interesting addition because this ties into project dates and there's a great deal of information on that one page right there. So I would suggest maybe you may want to include this in a more frequent time frame than once a year. Or maybe
We'd be
every,
glad to do that.
possibly every quarter, maybe. Because it's not going, there may not be a great deal of change in, well, won't be a change in most of them. But just like the time frame on the Columbia Avenue project, that could change once we realize that 10, 12, whatever it is, 2020
it's
is
not gonna be
not going to be, we might want to put something different on that and bring that back. I think I'd do this once a quarter. And because to me, this is a very interesting report.
And our plan is to update this every month for the benefit of our own, internal,
Okay.
for city administrator who can look at a snapshot and see what's going on, as well as our project managers to see, and also to help us on the accounting side, just to make sure that we're recording, that we have all the most current information. So we're gonna be updating this monthly ourselves, so we're happy to come back every quarter.
Sure.
Okay, let's do it in a quarter now, unless the committee says to do it monthly whenever we do our report, because the only thing you would have to do is just touch on the one or two changes that are made in it, and the rest of it stays the same. Are we comfortable with a month or a quarter?
Quarter's fine, but yeah, I think it is important to see it, because obviously when we were ranking projects, Eric would say, and remember,
Yeah,
if we don't rank this
The
one
clock
high,
is
there's,
ticking.
Yeah.
the clock is ticking, we wanna make sure we use all funds available, so,
Yep.
yeah.
okay, let's do that then.
Glad to.
Any other questions or comments? Then let's go to monthly reports.
The last item I have, and again, a short caption, is on the monthly reports. It follows very close to what Eric had mentioned in the budget presentation. We know the increase that we've seen with local sales tax. We've seen that development fees have been kind of a portion of what they were in the previous year or two. And I did notice, though, that if you look at the conference center, that last year they had a profit in this year, or in this month, and they had a loss. So it's almost one that, in doing the comparison, you can kind of see, what happened last year to the current. But this is actually the first loss they've had since July. So they've had profits but they did have a loss in this month.
But we still, with the conference center, are above
Yes.
where we were last year.
Exactly.
It has been a strong year.
Yes.
Overall, compared to the previous year.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, ma'am, it is paid off.
Yeah.
Do they send any, like, two-sentence synopsis on why? I mean, that's an $86,000 swing from last March.
We don't have answer yet, but it is something that I think would be worthwhile.
We can find
Yeah.
out. They,
That'd be great to know, and I'd still
Yeah,
love to know what
absolutely.
that capital asset value is.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And the one number that's not on the monthly reports, but it's a number that impacted the budget amendments that Michael went over earlier, is, if you remember, we were talking about there still being a $600,000 deficit in the multipurpose capital projects fund. And when Michael was going through the amendments, you probably realized there was not anything to make up that deficit. And the reason was, we actually had a good result, but it was unanticipated, is the state got in contact with us and said, we have a refund for you. And what it was on the Goose Creek bypass. And what had happened is, we had invoices turned into us of $2.8 million. And it turns out our total liability was only over $2 million. So they're letting us know that we have an $800,000 refund, which they now have refunded to us. But in essence, that deficit was able to be covered by that refund. So
There was a component of that project that we called the Goose Creek Gap that was essentially not going to get completed by the state as part of their work out there. So we said, well, we've got to complete this in conjunction with their work, so that there's not this unexplainable narrowing of the road. And so we stepped up to make sure that happened, and I believe TDOT provided some further review or maybe a little different interpretation and determined that we were eligible to get some of that money back. So that was a very pleasant surprise. You don't always get those kind of surprises from TDOT. A lot of times they work the other way, so we're grateful. And we've checked and double-checked, and we've got the repayment and thought it was appropriate to put it in that capital fund, which is what paid for it to begin with. So that helps offset the projected or potential deficits in that fund, so it puts us in a very good position. We had planned to go to the general fund to help offset that, so that takes a little bit of pressure off of that fund as well.
And 19 was the final year of a 3-year plan to rectify that deficit in the capital project fund from expenses that had occurred several years ago that were not eligible for bond reimbursement. So we had been marching along with the first 2 years, and then this was going to be the year to do that reconciliation. And then probably within 10 business days of TDOT contacting us about this $800,000, we received we actually received a check in the mail rather than a wire. So they were ready to pay us those funds. They had made a decision. So we have recorded that revenue.
I want to just go back to say, in looking at the conference center, the March was the lowest gross revenue in, both of those years that we've got in there. It's on number 13. Yeah, that was.
We'll find out.
Something that's been scheduled and got canceled.
Now, that could happen. That could
That would just
happen.
be my educated guess, but I don't know. Because they've been performing so well the rest of the year, so that's what's.
And they had one other year-over-year, about a year and a half ago, that came from from a big cancellation. I think it was a company that pulled out of a December event that caused a huge swing. So we'll inquire as to what that was caused from in 19.
Any other questions of the monthly reports? Any other business to come before the committee? Then I'll entertain the next motion. Proper motion, is there a second? All in favor? Oh,
May I just, one moment, our next meeting for the month of June, Mr. Chairman, I believe we plan to go back to a 2 p.m. start time, if that is still the preference of the committee. But we'll just ask you if that's still what you wish to do.
Whatever y'all want to do. We've moved out of the budget presentations that ate up a lot of time, so we were going to shift back to 2, but we're glad to do whatever you all would like to do.
Let's just do it for this one time, and if we want to
Okay.
decide to
Go back to 2.
I've got to go back to 2 o'clock.
Okay.
okay, that's fine.
And Mr. Chairman, that would be on June the 13th,
All right.
our next meeting.
We have a motion and a second. All in favor indicate by saying aye. Aye. We are adjourned.